Hey, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is Valerie and I'm Nathan. Hi, Nathan.
Hello. Good to be back.
Hi. We are here doing a part 2 of a 2-part series where what we're doing today is a follow-up from last week's episode where I read the article Confronting Men's Violence Against Women and Girls in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by Suzanne E. Greco. And I don't generally read an entire article, but I felt like this is one of those times where I wanted to, in preparation for this conversation that Nathan and I are going to have right now with you in tackling this very challenging subject. So Nathan, first of all, before we jump in to these points that we want to make today, talk us through what was your experience in studying Suzanne's talk as you think about your own journey in better understanding this kind of painful topic.
Yeah, I think when I think back to my own faith journey, that there was this sense when I was younger of the importance of protecting the institution, because if you see the institution as the means of salvation, you know, a ship at sea, or kind of metaphorically, the carrying the Ark of the Covenant in front of you in battle, like this thing, this object becomes the source of salvation. It becomes the source of winning the battle. It becomes the source of getting somewhere safely. Then you can take the mindset that there might be some human casualties along the way in the effort to preserve the more important institution or the greater good. As I've gone on my faith journey, I've come to realize that really that's absurd, and that protecting God's children is the purpose of anything that we do. And so I have learned to see through these kind of illusions of the importance of protecting the institution, and more about seeing the individual suffering that's taking place. And I think this is really the crux of her article, is trying to allow all members of the church to rethink the position that the institution is more important than any individual.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is such a big topic that, well, and I think because we've been recently reminded via a few new news items and court findings and things like this, that institutional patriarchy causes harm every day. And that is something that needs to be looked at, not just from a theoretical lens, but we need to look at how can any of us that have a public platform shine a light on this so that we can help ourselves and those whom we love better, feel safer, for one thing. But also just keep in mind, like what Nathan was just saying is really important, is that I think sometimes we mistake the institution for God. And what we want to really presence today in this conversation, where we're going to really hit on some key points, is that institutions, and even the men that run institutions, don't need to be bad people, or don't need to be sort of, I don't know, evil incarnate to cause harm. All that needs to happen is sort of an accumulation of incentives to create almost like a petri dish where harm happens. And so what we wanted to do today is talk about why is it that the LDS Church continues to deny any relationship between patriarchy and sex abuse, and also sex abuse underreporting. When we were studying this, I was talking about the underreporting, and Nathan reminded me from some of our other conversations on this podcast, actually, that it isn't just underreporting, it's actually the abuse itself. That there is a correlation between abuse of all kinds and patriarchy. And then you add the layer of underreporting when it happens inside of the system. And so Our premise of today is, as I sort of started to mention, institutions don't need to have bad actors to cause harm. They just need incentives. And what we're really going to dig into today is that when authority is centralized and critique is turned into a spiritual sin, and also in reputation is treated as sacred, institutions are naturally just going to move into this mode of self-protection. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is certainly not the only institution, but it's ours. It's our home institution. And for those who would call us harsh critics, we do this because we care about the church. And we love the things that we've learned that have caused us to be brave enough to talk about this. And so therefore, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to talk about one sort of fundamental issue that we think sort of brings about a handful of other patterns that we notice in the church that Suzanne brings up and we just want to highlight.
Yeah, so just real quick, you said that centralized authority, critique of spiritualized, and reputation of sacred. I mean, those are important to talk about, because centralized authority means that the people making the rules are not the people dealing with the on the ground happenings, right? Like, I can make rules about how to handle, abuse when I'm not the one making the reports or receiving the reports. And then you have critique of spiritualized, right? So as science and technology teach us more and more about what's really happening to people, and we come back and say, hey, we may not be doing things right, they turn around and say, well, you're attacking God. And so this becomes a problem. It becomes science versus God instead of science with God. And then reputation is sacred. I kind of mentioned that, but anything that could potentially hurt converts to the church with a bad public image is considered like, damning their souls. And so you have to protect the church's image so that people are willing to join the church so that they can go to heaven. And so we've got this massive setup for internal problems that are not going to have a willing resolution.
Yeah. Wow. Really, really well said. Good setup. So the first thing that we want to bring up that probably sort of, you were talking about a ship metaphor, the thing that kind of drives the entire ship and leads to sort of everything else is a refusal to question the divinity of the institution itself. And so if we believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is sort of the true church, then we believe that patriarchy is called of God. And then what ends up happening is this theology is basically a shield against all kind of reform. Like, there's nothing else that one can say when one demands that the church is true and that patriarchy is of God.
So again, this kind of goes back to this idea that if the ship is the only thing that can save us, we are in fact obligated to save the ship, even at the expense of individual members of the crew. And so to me, what I think you have to start with is the ship is good, but the ship is not God. And you mentioned that earlier, right? Is that we do want, of course, to have a healthy institution that's functioning well, but we got to remember what the purpose of the institution is. It is, in fact, to save people. And anytime we put the ship in front of people, then we create, these difficult problems that we're seeing. And also, you have to be very, very careful about this idea of one true church. Because if you really, really come from the perspective that the prophet goes into the temple every Tuesday and gets his instructions directly from Jesus, then the question arises, why has Jesus never said to the prophet, patriarchy is bad? And the fact of the matter is that we have to be able to come at it from the perspective that people are doing the best that they can, but we're always learning, and we should always be learning. Even if we're the prophet, we're always, always, always learning.
So what you have here is this problem. If patriarchy is God ordained, then acknowledging that it is harmful does one of two things. Either God designed a harmful system and we just need to deal with it, or those running the church, God's ordained leaders, have somehow misunderstood God. They got it wrong. in either case, this is not only just, problematic, it's reputationally inconvenient, but it's destabilizing to the entire system. Either God doesn't care that patriarchy is harmful, or the leaders missed something, which is what Nathan, I believe, right, is that the leaders have been conditioned by a society that has long been steeped in patriarchy, and they're wrong. But that is very, very scary. And so they deny either of these things. And well, denial becomes necessary, not just convenient. They have to deny it, because denying it makes the system remain viable, although more and more we're recognizing that it's not viable because it's causing so many problems and so much harm.
Right.
You mentioned something else in our preparation that I'm remembering. Do you remember what you were talking about?
We talked about a lot of things. What are you specifically thinking about?
Thinking about how there's a third option, which is patriarchy is called of God.
Oh, right.
And yeah, go on. Do you want to finish that one?
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's a narrative in the Book of Mormon that comes from the Book of Jacob, where Jacob talks about men not leading their women correctly and being abusive to their women. And he creates this narrative of we have really, really, really got to teach our men how to properly run a patriarchal system. And so instead of acknowledging that patriarchy is the basis of abuse and a setup for failure, it's no, patriarchy is of God. We just have to be able to run patriarchy better. And we've talked about this before, and I've used this analogy before with slavery, in the 1840s. How would it have looked if, President Lincoln had said to the Southern states, we're going to let you keep slavery, but we need to have lots and lots of classes taught to the masters about how to be nicer to slaves. Saying something like that is ridiculous and maybe even borderline offensive. But my point is that the way you get rid of the abuses of slavery is to abolish slavery. It's not to teach the masters how to be nicer and teach the slaves how to be more submissive. It's to eliminate slavery. And I'll stand by this statement. The only way to fully eliminate the abuses that come from patriarchy is to eliminate patriarchy.
Amen, brother. And that right there is sort of the fountainhead of all of the problems, because if patriarchy is framed as divinely mandated, then any critique is considered anti-church, anti-Mormon, anti-God. And so that's the fundamental problem that we're having here, is that as long as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints maintains that it is ordained of God and that it is the one and only true church, any suggestion that there is a problem with patriarchy, or with anything that flows from it, like worthiness interviews or obedience culture or sexual shaming or anything like that, it's just dismissed. It's dismissed as anti-church, anti-God, anti-Mormon, and whether or not it's empirically validated does not matter, right? And so, as we've sort of mentioned in other contexts, if you begin with the conclusion and then back everything out from the conclusion, like you have to manufacture your data to match the already existing conclusion, then evidence or harm or abuse can't matter, because you have to maintain your conclusion. And so that right there is fundamentally the problem.
Yeah. So, this comes back to another question that we're taught often in the church, which is that religion and science do not have to agree. And if they don't agree, always choose religion over science. And I think that in a more mature spiritual progression, what we come to realize is that science is one way that God manifests themselves. And, Hugh B. Brown taught this to his own detriment. It got him partially it was responsible for getting removed out of the first presidency. But Hugh B. Brown said, all learning comes from tablets of stone, be it the stone tablets of Mount Sinai, where the 10 Commandments were written, or the fossils we dig up from the earth. his point is science and religion work together. And if there's a conflict, we need to figure out why and how to reconcile it. And so what Valerie is talking about there is the social sciences clearly indicate that patriarchy is harmful. So if we ignore that and say, no, our religious system trumps science, it will be to our own detriment.
Right. And so much of what religious systems are actually a construction of the understanding of the culture of the day. It's humanity's earnest attempt to understand their nature in the context of their ultimate concern. So by default, religion always needs to be a restoration of more and more and more truth based on how humanity is growing closer to greater light and truth. And so it certainly does not stand still, and wisdom will always be unfolding as humanity becomes more and more mature. So oftentimes it is actually, in fact, science that helps religious systems become more integrity-based. And so as opposed to sticking to one thing and saying, we're going to do this forever because it used to be that way, no, the opposite needs to be true. And other church systems throughout the world are actually stepping into that. Greco's article talks about other religious systems recognizing the harm in patriarchy and creating curriculum in their spiritual formation programs to align with science, to align with social science findings. Okay, so when you have a system that is, as we have mentioned before, if you demand that this is the true church, that this is God speaking, and therefore you cannot either, you feel as if you're sort of stuck because you're having to acknowledge, if you admit that this is problematic, you're admitting either that God designed a harmful system or that the leaders have misunderstood God. When you decide you can't do that, you stick with this, you ignore the social sciences, you ignore the harm done, then these are the four patterns that unfold. And some of these are a review. We've spoken about them before, so we'll kind of just brush through them, some of them a little more quickly than others. First pattern is you're going to handle abuse internally instead of externally. So first and foremost is you have to play it down, because you can't really square why would it happen in a system that is ordained of God. You don't want to get external people involved, right? You don't want to get the police involved. You don't want to get social science people such as therapists, social workers involved. You keep it in-house so that you can keep the buzz down and so that you can interpret it on your own terms. And want to talk about a couple of the ways that this is sometimes interpreted. This is a little bit of a review, but we can just quickly go through it.
Well, to me, the biggest problem here is this. We worked really, really hard as a religion to create a separation of church and state because we didn't want the state to determine how we practiced religion. But now that we've created successfully in the United States and other parts of the free world a separation of church and state, we now want to ignore the state. We want church to dominate the state. So anytime an incidence of abuse comes forward to an ecclesiastical leader, they are basically instructed to leave the court system out of this. And this is incredibly problematic. Even if you believe that the spiritual aspect is more important than the legal aspect is there for a reason. It is to protect people. There are legal processes that have to be undertaken when a law is broken, and it is not the church's right. Now that we have got separation of church and state, the church does not have the right to trump the state and the protections and also the reformative behaviors that are the state's rights to apply to these situations. The church does not have the right to leave them out. And yet that's how we are behaving. That's my biggest beef with what we're seeing. And again, it's not just the LDS Church. The Catholic Church has been through this. The Baptist Church has been through this. But religious systems have to involve legal authorities because that is the way the system is set up. And the churches have agreed to that system.
Well, and I think what we find happening is that because fundamentally there isn't an admission that there is a problem as major as it is, and that it's part of a structural problem. It's the church's structure that is partly causing the problem, or in great part causing the problem. And since we can't even acknowledge that, then what we do is we keep it in-house. We want our own bishops and stake presidents to take care of it. We turn this into an issue where we're mandating or oftentimes inviting forgiveness from the victim, as opposed to handling the larger problem. And also sometimes silence from the victim is framed as faithfulness. And what's really going on here is a lot of alternative narratives to not actually address the fundamental problem, which is that we have a structural issue that is causing abuse, which is then causing the need to hide or not report the abuse. And what's going on here also is that the church, again, I don't think there is malicious intent here, but there's lots of incentive to preserve a low profile, to preserve order in the church. This isn't about justice. This isn't even about helping either the victim or the perpetrator get the help that they need. It's really about shielding the institution from external scrutiny.
Exactly.
It's not about any of the parties that are involved and are in harm's way or in pain or causing pain. And those causing pain are also in pain. It's ultimately about shielding the institution from external scrutiny. Ooh, okay, such a problem. Okay, let's go to the next pattern here. First pattern was keeping things in-house. This one is, all of these are kind of first cousins to one another, but they all sort of flow from the inability to scrutinize the structure of institutional patriarchy in the LDS Church.
Yeah. So churches and organizations that don't want to be scrutinized, they want to then control what is publicly known, right? And it is a true statement that the more transparent a system is, the less likely it is to be subject or to have internal instances of abuse or fraud or whatever it is. Okay. The more transparent we are, the more honest and ethical we're going to act. And so the LDS Church does not keep, or at least if it does keep, it doesn't make publicly available data on how much abuse is actually taking place within the system, both by ecclesiastical leaders against members, but also within the members' families and structures themselves. Both are going to be both are risk factors when you have a patriarchal system. Leaders against members, and then husbands against wives and children within the families. If that data were kept, the church would have to acknowledge that there's a problem. And if that data were made public, then there would, of course, become public pressure to alter systems. And so it makes a lot of sense that institutions that don't want to be altered don't make their data public.
Well, and I think what this comes down to is, if we can't address that there is a structural issue, then we're going to try to maintain that there isn't an issue at all. And the very best way to maintain that there is no issue is to do whatever it takes to create plausible deniability, which is, we don't have any data that says there's a problem, therefore there isn't a problem.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is the data isn't being collected because we're trying to maintain that this isn't a problem. If you collect the data, you can fix the problem by monitoring what's actually going on. But if you don't want to admit that it's a problem at all, or certainly that it's a structural problem, then the very best way to do that is to not address any, or certainly not correlate how much or how often this is happening. And I find this incredibly fascinating, because the amount of money that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints pays out in lawsuit settlements would be, I don't even have, because we don't keep records, right? I don't know how much that is, but it's a lot of money, and it would be in their financial best interest, from the perspective of risk management, to know what is going on and how much is this costing us. But my understanding is that they don't even do that because there is such a high anxiety associated with addressing how big this problem is.
Well, and I think it speaks a little bit to maybe some intentions that could be potentially seen as disingenuous, because you have actually had on your podcast people who have been hired by the church to research statistics in other areas. You have had people on your podcast who have been researched by the church to find out why people are leaving. Yeah. We have a whole department that's trying to figure out what helps non-members become members. We research that ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Sorry, that's the better word. We research those things ad nauseum. So it's not like the church is opposed to statistical analysis. And so it makes me a little worried that the church knows deep down inside that if they research these numbers, they would find there's a problem. And I almost worry that it's an intentional decision to ignore this question, because I know the church researches other questions.
To me, it speaks to the shadow of the church, that I think our shadows are deeply sexual. They're about sexuality, they're about gender, they're about power. And all of this is deeply interwoven with patriarchy. Since the very, very beginning of the church, we've been dealing with issues of sexuality, gender, and power. And what we have in this institutional patriarchy is a massive shadow around that. And again, to sort of circle us back to the beginning of our conversation, if you believe that this structure, this patriarchal structure, is ordained of God, you cannot afford to run data on what's going on in this, that you don't want to find correlation or cause that is connected to patriarchy and abuse. Like, say, for example, if somebody took the social science data and said, that's really interesting, they're claiming in the social science world that this is happening. Let's run some numbers about how much patriarchy or how much is going on in our church. What would they find, Nathan?
Yeah, it wouldn't be pretty.
It would be a corroboration of what the social sciences are already finding, even in informal settings. And yet what we have here is actually a formal structural patriarchy. And so it has the potential to be incredibly destabilizing feels like an understatement.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think the church has a second shadow too, besides its sexuality, and that is bad publicity. Because if you go back to, Joseph saw God, that wasn't very popular. Then you've got Book of Mormon, Trump's Bible, that was not popular with our Christian brothers and sisters. Then we practiced polygamy. Then we're like the last institution on the planet to allow Black people to have equal rights within the church.
I think you're exaggerating a little.
Okay, it might be exaggerating slightly, but among the civilized free worlds, I think only South Africa was behind us, really, because Europe all had ended slavery before we did as the United States, and we were among the very last institutions in the United States. So a little bit of hyperbole, but my point is the church has suffered from some PR crises throughout its lifetime, as well as some sexual crises. And I think that the church really tries to avoid bad PR. I think that's a big deal to it.
Well, I think that every church probably does that. I'm not justifying the church, but yeah, we have sort of we've got, I guess, an institutional trauma history where, and honestly, I think in some ways it, everything that you mentioned isn't directly connected to polygamy, but I do think because of our polygamy origins, it does feel to me like we've been trying for a very long time to fit in with the normal people, right? Like, oh, we're just a normal Christian church. Please respect us. Just, like some of the other, I don't know, more traditional evangelical churches in the United States, at least. And so, trying to fit in, to feel successful, to feel viable, to feel like we did experience a period of a lot of growth and things like that. And now we're, I think, floundering again. We're having some troubles maintaining members and things like that. So yes. Okay. So let's circle back to fundamentally, we will not admit that there is any correlation between patriarchy and sexual abuse and the reporting of sexual abuse. And this is leading to the following patterns, and we're going to just end with the last couple here. So first of all, we have, okay, so because we keep everything in-house and try to control what needs to be known, the next natural outcome of that is going to be that when and if we do need to get anything legal involved, we use legal counsel to protect the institution and not the victims of abuse.
Exactly. And I think what we've seen, and we've talked about these cases, the Arizona case, the West Virginia case, not too long ago, there was a case in Oregon. And what ends up happening, and of course, we don't know all the cases because many of these things get public or get settled privately and don't become known. But what we know from some of the public cases is that in each case, leaders went to church representing lawyers that represented the church, as opposed to lawyers that represented the victims or the legal issues, within the state. And church lawyers are designed to protect the church. They don't care about the victims. They may say they care about the victims, but they don't. They're hired to protect an institution. And so when you start down the path of, I got my legal advice from lawyers who are hired by the church to protect the church, you will inevitably hurt the victims.
Something else that has come up over and over again is that when a priesthood leader calls this hotline that is manned by, I think it's Curtin McConkie, the church's law firm, they are going to offer counsel based on the local laws, like the mandated reported local laws, some of which are more advocating and protecting of victims and some are less so. And so the advice sometimes that is given may be legally sound, meaning that, no, you can keep this to yourself. This is something that you don't have to report, but they're not actually calling upon a higher law, which is a moral law. That from the perspective of, say, me as a mental health worker, there is no state specific law based on that I am beholden to, or that I would be beholden to, even if that's what my industry said. We are mandated reporters. If somebody is in harm's way, we report it, period. Let me ask you a question, Nathan. You may not know the answer to this, but is there a circumstance under which a bishop would be in a state where he is a mandated reporter and then he will report it? Because I guess I would like to believe that's happening. I
don't know. I don't know, because I do think there are different laws for clergy than there are for even mental health workers. And so whereas mental health workers are just almost universally mandated reporters, as far as I know, in all 50 states, it can be different for clergy. And there's reasons for that we don't have to get into. But I think your point is the one that's most important, right? Ultimately, the lens that we're looking through is either the lens of protecting the institution, or the lens of rehabilitating the perpetrator, or the lens of protecting the victim. Okay. One of those three lenses is our primary lens. And if it's not protecting a victim, I would be cautious.
Yeah. Well, and I think what we're sort of hopefully bringing home in terms of our prevailing point is that when ultimately it all comes down to protecting the institution, this is a problem, because it becomes the institution is chosen as the primary victim and not the victim of sexual abuse. And in this case, legal insulation becomes seen as the ultimate moral authority, that we do whatever it takes to protect the church. And this is often seen as, even in some ways, a moral inversion. What protects the institution is treated as synonymous as right, as ultimately God's will, even if it means that children and women and other vulnerable people are chronically in harm's way. As long as the church is safe, everything is okay. Okay, final pattern that we want to walk you through is that in institutional patriarchies, because they are structured as they are, there is an absolute hierarchy in who gets believed. And Greco's article talks about this in some detail, but there will always be a credibility issue when a woman or certainly a child reports that they are abused, because most of the time who they report to is to a man. And so there's a very, very predictable outcome, because this is an asymmetrical power structure. Because there is an asymmetrical power structure, the credibility will always be questioned, and oftentimes men are going to defend or minimize the behavior of their friends, especially because in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, somebody who is reported is going to be a priesthood leader, a friend, a colleague of the person who is sort of the first responder to someone who is reporting sexual abuse in the church.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. And if I were going to ask, what's the young lady's name who wrote the article?
Suzanne Greco.
Yeah. If I were going to ask Suzanne one question about her article, it might be this. She suggested that one way around this patriarchal system without dismantling the patriarchal system would be to have women report to women within the church system. I wonder just a little bit if maybe having an independent third body outside of the church system might be even safer. I have no problem with women reporting to women. I agree with her on that.
Mm-hmm.
My experience, though, is that there are still many women within the church system who either support the patriarchy or ultimately they themselves report to a patriarchal leader. And it might even compromise women within the church system's ability to empathize with other women. I know at BYU, they tried for a long time to have women report to the honor code office if they were victims of sexual assault. And it was so bad that the NCAA had to step in and create an independent Title IX office. And BYU wanted that Title IX office to report to the honor code office. And the NCAA said, hell no. The whole reason a Title IX office works is it has to be a completely independent body where women know that they are safe to report what has happened to them. And so I agree with Suzanne in the sense that women reporting to women is safer, but I wonder if it needs to be women outside of the church so that there is no ultimate patriarch that stands at the top of that. What do you think?
No, I couldn't agree more. My sense from her article was that, and now that you say that, I'm starting to question myself, even though I feel like I studied that article quite a bit. My sense is that her recommendation is the undoing of the structure itself, that patriarchy needs to go away. Now, whether or not having, like, I know because of her 3 recommendations, one of them was that women report to women. I guess maybe she was referencing within the LDS church.
That was the sense I got.
Okay.
Because I know, like, when you were a Relief Society president, a woman might feel safe sharing something with you, but ultimately you couldn't do anything until you reported to the bishop.
Right. Well, and I think the problem there is that the women who are called into ecclesiastical callings in an institutional patriarchy are generally guardians of the patriarchy, which is why they got called there in the first place.
Exactly.
And as soon as they start, rattling the cage a little bit, they get released. That was very much the reason why I got released from stake primary president, right? Long before my Latter-day Struggles reform days, I started having original thoughts and defining myself and pressuring my state presidency member, the person whom I reported to, and he didn't like that.
Right.
And so I'm inclined to agree with you, Nathan, that if the recommendation were solely to have women report to women, but we are not dismantling or speaking of the need to dismantle the structure itself, this could be a means of extra trauma for the abuse victim if the woman they report to colludes in all of these patterns that we have been talking about this hour.
Right. Because even if it's a visiting teacher, they report to the Relief Society president, who reports to the bishop. And so I think that all religious institutions, I think the Catholic Church, I think the Baptist Church, I think the Methodist Church, they ought to have the equivalent of an independent Title IX office where women can go and know whatever they say is not going to get back to their bishop, and that the person they report to is going to give them legal counsel based on their protection first.
Right. And I think what you're describing is a system that is mature enough to privilege the actual safety and well-being of its constituents more than its own safety. Right. And I think fundamentally, as we kind of close up today, that's what we're sort of talking about is, with all due respect, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is in, and maybe always has been, a mode of self-protection. It's trying to preserve and protect itself. And, you know, all human beings and institutions are inclined this way. We are self-preserving by nature. I get that. And also, as we evolve and mature and grow, it is my hope that we would move beyond self-preservation and self-protection as our primary incentive, and that we become capable of self-confrontation when we are recognizing that we have created a system, or we are governing and running a system with millions of people in it that is a setup to be harmful to many, many of the people in it. And that's sort of what we're talking about in these last two episodes. And I know this has been, the article was profoundly insightful, compelling, important, and strong. It said some strong things. And I think what we're hopefully articulating here is, in very clear ways, institutional patriarchies structurally are setups to be self-preserving at the expense of victims of sexual and other kinds of abuse.
Right. So ultimately, you know, what we have to be working for is dismantling of patriarchy.
Yeah.
But until that happens, there need to be independent and safe systems for women and men to be able to report abuse, so that the numbers can be had, the feedback can be given, and ultimately we can come to a place where we can say things like, okay, we've learned something here, right? So I'm going to give credit to Bruce R. McConkie, because after he buckled down 100 times that the priesthood ban would never be lifted, and it was lifted, he went back to BYU and he said, I was wrong. I was looking through a limited lens and I was wrong, and I am sorry for what I said previously about Black people. I'm not saying Bruce R. McConkie was perfect, but he handled that well. And I would encourage all people who are members of this institution or any institution to be able to say, we are often working with limited knowledge. Is there something new for us to learn? Because that growth mindset, that curiosity mindset, that how can we be better today than we were yesterday mindset, is the only mindset that's going to fix these problems.
And the sooner the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints leaders can have the courage to confront the foundation, you know, the patriarchal foundation of this church, the healthier this church has the potential of becoming. It is my feeling that the LDS Church, as an institutional patriarchy, it doesn't have a successful prognosis in the long run, because we are moving rapidly into a world that sees patriarchy for what it is, an antiquated, out of date system of governance that has nothing to do with God. And if you have a public platform, or if you have the ability to share this with your friends and loved ones, just so that we can normalize this kind of dialogue in and around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we want to make this a more normal way of thinking about it, not from the perspective of just being critical and angry, because I don't feel angry about this at all. I feel passionate because I care about the best interest and the safety and well-being of the things that matter most to me. And that would be you, all of you. And that would be my primary language of faith is the LDS Church. And I want it to become as healthy as it possibly can be. And foundationally, it cannot begin to thrive until we manage and deal with this particular issue. So thanks you all for being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. Your support for this podcast is extremely valuable to us. If Valerie's work has made an impact in your life, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review. For info on webinars, classes, support groups, and live events, click the link in today's show notes or visit our website at latterdaystruggles.com. Latter-day Struggles is a proud member of the Dialogue Podcasting Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.